This is the 13th and final part to the Vincal Holmes mystery. It's highly recommended you check out the other videos before continuing. The story starts in 2570 BC. Calvin and Josh's ancestors lived in Egypt. They were key players in the Pyramid of Khafre being constructed. Just when the pyramid was finished, the two entered and traveled deep inside. They carved 3 figures into the wall of one of the tombs. Those carvings remained untouched for centuries upon centuries. Now we fast forward to the 1990s. Kyle suggested to Calvin he make a YouTube channel. And as stated in the Who is Trundle TV video, Calvin scoffed in Kyle's face and took his lunch money. With that lunch money, Calvin decided to buy a computer and camera. He then started up a YouTube channel. He made the best videos on the website. Everybody loved them. Kyle, being uncultured, didn't watch much YouTube at the time, so he didn't notice. Not until 1993 at least. 1993 is when Kyle found out Calvin went behind his back to create a YouTube channel, so Kyle took Calvin to court. The legal battle went on for years and years. We now move on to 2012. 2 people ventured into the Pyramid of Khafre to see what secrets were in there. They found the 3 carvings and posted them online for everyone to see. As you all know, Calvin turned those carvings into one of the best animated shows of all time. Josh was hired as the executive producer. Together they held all the horses' fame. Now on to September 8, 2015. The legal battle between Kyle and Calvin has ended. The agreement was that Kyle and Calvin create a YouTube channel with Kyle together, so they created Calvin. For the next couple years, Calvin, Kyle, Josh, Austin and Cranberry Dan were the best of friends. Dan even made everybody friendship bracelets. They all met at different points in their lives, but they all met up with each other and clicked instantly. Or at least that's how it looked from the outside. Josh and Calvin weren't actually the best of friends. They were under contract to appear friendly. Calvin and Josh had an intense disagreement with horses. Josh thought it would be better if the character Bart was designed to be standing on 2 legs. Calvin disagreed and thought Bart should remain on all 4s. The two couldn't settle their differences and Josh threatened to leave horses, but Calvin couldn't let that happen. Josh owned a solid 90% of the company. Calvin originally had 100% of the company, but then he sold 90% of it to Josh for a bunch of popsicles. Calvin then made an hour-long popsicle review with those popsicles. So Calvin desperately needed Josh to stay so he wouldn't potentially lose all creative control of horses, but Calvin also wasn't about to let Bart be designed on 2 legs, so the two created a contract. The end result was that Bart would remain on all 4s if Calvin gave Josh a shoulder massage at least once a week. They remained in context purely for business despite hating each other. But as time went on, the fans noticed that in their daily vlogs their chemistry wasn't the same. So then Josh and Calvin added to the contract. They had to appear friendly in public to keep up their images. That wasn't the only rift in the friend group. Calvin was annoyed at Kyle for not posting often to Calvin, and Kyle thought he was too cool for school to listen to Calvin because he met a monkey. Josh and Kyle also had their occasional arguments. One day Josh lost his favorite pair of paints and then Kyle showed up wearing a very similar looking pair of pants. Kyle swears he didn't take Josh's pants, but Josh doesn't believe him. The final rift in the friend group was Austin. Austin was jealous of everything. He was jealous he wasn't invited into the horses crew. He was jealous he wasn't a part of Calvin, and he wasn't any kind of hero like Cranberry Dan was. And on top of everything, Austin had a deep romantic love for Josh that wasn't mutual. Austin had nothing going for him. Austin faked being happy for years, but as time went on he became more and more upset. At one point he decided to do something about it. He created Gilded Cheese Gaming. He was hoping this would be his claim to fame. Unfortunately, it epically failed. Austin was fed up with his life. He needed to do something drastic. For the next few months he studied the dynamics of the group to try and find a way to elevate himself to be at the center, but he couldn't. He did notice who was at the center, however. Cranberry Dan. Cranberry Dan was the glue holding the group together. Austin thought if Cranberry Dan was out of the picture he then could be the glue. Austin then devised a plan. He showed up unannounced to Cranberry Dan's New York apartment. Cranberry Dan, being the nice fellow he is, welcomed Austin in and prepared him a nice meal. Austin ate that meal and asked for seconds before Dan had even touched his food. Dan hadn't prepared seconds. He only made enough for Austin and him to have one plate. Dan sacrificed his plate so Austin could have seconds. After Austin scarfed down his seconds, he suggested the two watch their favorite playlist on YouTube. Yes, Cranberry Dan asked if they could start from the beginning since he hasn't watched the early ones in a while. Austin agreed as he hadn't watched them in a couple of days and was itching to rewatch them. They watched Yes until the sun went down. They looked at each other at the same time and in unison they both yelled out marathon. Dan emailed his boss saying he was sick and couldn't show up to work the following day. The two then watched Yes all the way to the morning. Suddenly Dan's favorite video was on. Austin then shed a single tear, for he knew what he had to do. He stood up, pulled a gun out of his pocket and shot Dan 3 times in the chest. Austin knew Cranberry Dan only lets his guard down during his favorite Yes video. He also knew that this was the only way he would have been able to defeat Dan. Austin stole Cranberry Dan's dual disc and Yu-Gi-Oh cards, then fled the apartment. The world had lost a hero to Austin's greed. Austin had hoped he could fill Cranberry Dan's spot in his friend group, but he couldn't. Calvin, Josh and Kyle became even closer than ever before. They knew that Cranberry Dan would want them to set their differences aside and be close friends forever. So that's what happened. Austin now felt even more left out. He grew angrier and angrier. He then knew he had to take even more drastic measures. With Cranberry Dan's dual disc he played his Yu-Gi-Oh card time machine. Austin time traveled to 2057 BC. He suddenly appeared in front of Calvin and Josh's ancestors in the Pyramid of Khafra. Austin challenged the two to a 2-on-1 Yu-Gi-Oh battle. They accepted. Austin used Cranberry Dan's deck. Using Dan's deck allowed Austin to play Exodia, the 3 Egyptian god, 3 blue-eyed white dragons, all in the first turn. Calvin and Josh's ancestors lost all their life points in that same turn. After his win, Austin destroyed the pyramid to assure the horses' figures were never sketched into the side of the pyramid. Austin again played Time Machine card and went right back to the future. He had hoped that he could now create horses with Josh and maybe even get a smooch from him. Again things didn't quite go Austin's way. Austin returned to see a drunk Calvin fighting a coked-out Kyle. Austin tried to break up the fight but couldn't. He then summoned the dark magician to pull them apart. "What's going on?" Austin yelled. "What do you mean?" Calvin asked. "Yeah, this is just another Tuesday," Kyle said. Austin then saw what he had done. By destroying horses, Calvin had no reason to live a good life. He turned into an alcoholic. Kyle never created Calvin, so he also had no meaning in life and became a coke addict. "Where is Josh?" Austin frantically shouted. Calvin turned away and started to sob. Kyle walked right up to Austin and punched him. "You know what happened?" Kyle yelled. Kyle then walked up to Calvin, gave him a kiss on the cheek and said, "It's gonna be alright. Let's get out of here and get some slushies." The two walked away. Austin asked to join, but Kyle pulled a gun out on Austin and threatened to shoot. Austin then decided he'll try to find out what happened to Josh on his own. He eventually found a news article. Cranberry Dan had won presidency. Josh was Dan's vice president. But one day during one of Dan's speeches, Josh took a bite out of Cranberry Dan's head for no known reason. Josh was immediately tackled. The world was disgusted with Josh's actions. Josh was tortured for years. The entire world had voted to keep Josh alive so he could be tortured until he dies of old age. Aside from 2 people, Calvin and Kyle voted to give Josh a quick death so he wouldn't have to suffer. The two knew that Cranberry Dan wouldn't want Josh to suffer like this. The entire world turned against the two. Even Austin voted for Josh to be tortured. When Calvin and Kyle found out how Austin voted, they removed their friendship bracelets. Without saying a word, Calvin and Kyle had cut off all ties with Austin. The world then voted to banish them, Calvin and Kyle, for voting differently. Calvin and Kyle resorted to drugs. One day the two snuck into Josh's cell, put him out of his misery. Ever since then, Calvin and Kyle lived on the run, stealing food and money for drugs. After reading that, Austin then realized what he had done. By removing horses from the future, he had destroyed everything he loved. There was no horses. No Calvin. No Yes. No Josh. And no Cranberry Dan. Austin then sobbed for hours. He regretted the choices he had made deeply. Austin decided to do the right thing. He decided to go back in time and stop himself from destroying the horses' carvings. He played the time machine Yu-Gi-Oh card again and went back to the pyramids. Yet again things didn't go his way. He immediately saw a dead body, and not just any dead body, his dead body. He was shocked and confused. He then suddenly saw a shadow behind him. He quickly turned around and saw the last person he expected to see. Cranberry Dan, how are you still alive? Asked Dan. I drained you of all your life points. Austin then noticed Dan was wearing a dual disc. Not just any dual disc, a golden one. Austin asked Dan how he survived the gunshots. Dan then proceeded to explain. Dan knew all along how Austin felt. He knew Austin wanted to play a bigger part of their friend group. Dan tried to help Austin as best he could. Dan went on special trips with just Austin to the public pool to try and help Austin feel more loved, but it didn't work and Dan knew that, but he was at a loss for what else to do. When Austin unexpectedly showed up at Dan's house, Dan suspected something was up. Dan's guard was up the entire time. At one point during the Yes Marathon, Dan excused himself to the bathroom, but he didn't need to pee. He actually went to his room and hid his golden dual disc and a certain deck of Yu-Gi-Oh cards. Dan then went back to watch Yes with Austin. Then when Dan's favorite Yes video came on, he couldn't help but to let his guard down. He was fully immersed. And that's when Austin shot him. Cranberry Dan felt like a fool for letting his guard down when he knew trouble was brewing, but he knew he couldn't help it. He just loved that Yes video so much. Austin then stole the dual disc and cards and left without a trace. But he made one mistake. He left the TV on and the Yes playlist kept playing. Dan knew what he had to do. He had to stay alive long enough to finish the playlist. He knew of the myth that the person who watches every Yes video in a row would gain the powers of a god. So that's what he did. He stayed alive from pure willpower. He knew it wasn't his time to go and that this was the only way to survive and stop Austin. After Dan told the story, Austin's rage grew. He felt like a fool for letting Yes play, and he was convinced that there was no way to turn things back to normal now. Austin knew he couldn't let Dan live knowing the truth. Austin then challenged Dan to a Yu-Gi-Oh duel. Dan tried to talk it out, but Austin wouldn't listen. The two commenced in the most intense battle of all time. The two dueled for weeks upon weeks. The duel ended in a draw. They both ran out of cards at the same time and they had an equal number of life points left. Dan then tried to resolve things peacefully, but Austin wouldn't budge. Austin then proposed they should finish this with a fist fight. Dan knew he had no choice but to fight. The two fought for like 2 seconds before Dan won. Austin was beaten so badly he was on his deathbed. Dan explained how he didn't want to do this, but his hand was forced. Austin asked to be alone as he dies. Dan agreed and left Austin alone. Austin then again played his time-traveling Yu-Gi-Oh card. He traveled to modern day. He locked himself in his room and took out his phone and he watched Yes. Austin stayed alive through pure stubbornness. Days passed and Austin had watched all of Yes. His wounds then suddenly healed and he too now had the powers of a god. He instantly teleported to Dan. Dan instantly reacts and the two end up in an all-out brawl. Their battle lasted for 100 years. The battle was so intense it intertwined 3 different timelines. These 3 timelines have been discussed in a previous episode. Any plot hole in this entire story is irrelevant because it happened because this battle made some things not make sense because of space and time reasons. For example, this is why the origins of the Yes playlist date back to 18th century Rome. But again, that's not what we're here to talk about today. Back to the battle. So there they are, Austin and Cranberry Dan. 100 years later, they are atop a volcano that's about to erupt. Austin is hanging on the edge about to fall. Cranberry puts his foot on Austin's hand. Austin then yells, "Do it, I deserve it." Cranberry Dan then sheds a single tear and kicks Austin into the volcano. Austin falls in and perishes. Dan then flies around the world. He looks at all the damage the two have caused. Countries have been destroyed because of their battle. Dan cries out for the damage he has caused. He eventually does a full lap and ends up back at the volcano where the battle ended. Dan then knew what he must do. He must restore humanity. But he knows he isn't powerful enough. He excreted all his power in the battle. Dan then does the only thing he can do. He takes out his dual disc and takes out his time travel card. Before he can play it, the volcano erupts. Lava spews everywhere. He then sees a frog frantically hopping around try to escape the lava. But he can't escape. The frog is now surrounded by lava. Dan refuses to see anyone else die, especially a frog. Dan rushes in to save it. He grabs the frog just in time, but in doing so he accidentally dropped his dual disc in the lava. He then gave the frog back to its family. The frogs then happily hopped away together. Dan smiled as he watched, but his smile quickly turned into a frown. Dan had ruined his one chance to go back in time. Or did he? Dan had just enough of his godly power left to go back in time for 30 seconds. So that's what he did. He traveled to 100 years in the past to his New York apartment. Dan was now face to face with his past self. Dan then pointed a gun at his past self. His past self understood what had happened. He saw the pain in his future self's eyes. They had both already accepted that this would one day happen. They just couldn't believe that that day was today. Dan then shot himself 3 times, in the chest. Dan died instantly. Future Dan then evaporated immediately after. Austin then busted the door open. He saw Cranberry Dan dead. He cried. He cried like a baby as he held Dan in his arms. Austin then felt the pain that his plan would cause others. He was ashamed of himself for even considering killing Dan. He went back to the others, Calvin, Kyle and Josh. He broke the news to them. The group cried and mourned Dan. After Dan's death, the four grew closer than ever. They had an unbreakable bond. They lived together in peace for the rest of their lives. Horses and Kelvin thrive. Videos never stopped being added to Yes. The world was in harmony. Now after all this is said, 2 mysteries still remain. First, what happened to Josh in the Horses universe? That will be revealed in time. Just stay patient for the commentaries, they will come out with time. And secondly, who is making these videos? It's me, Cranberry Dan. I wanted to tell my story. I hope you guys enjoyed.